few years ago, I had a discussion with a colleague about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she shared something with me that changed my entire perspective on life. She stated that changing the world starts with having the conversation. My name is Julian, and I'm here to do one thing today, and that is to continue that conversation. You see, it's still so upsetting that in 2022, your race, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, and where you live can still so negatively impact your health, wealth, wellness, career opportunities, and ultimately how long you live. I reflect on the aspects of health in this society now in 2022, and I think to myself, how can it be that still in 2022, African Americans have the highest rate of mortality for all types of cancers as compared to any other racial and ethnic group? How can it be that the African American infant mortality rate is still twice the national average and still the highest out of any other racial and ethnic group? How can it be that for our Hispanic population, those women are 40% more likely to contract cervical cancer, and they're even more likely to die from it? How can it be that our people that live in rural areas have shorter life expectancies than people that live in urban areas, and within urban areas, we still see big gaps in life expectancies across people that live in the same city? I also reflect on aspects of wealth, income, and housing in this country. How in 2022 do we still see such a gap in wealth, as white Americans still accumulate 3 times the wealth than any other racial and ethnic group? People of color are still less likely to own homes, and when they do own those homes, they're going to pay more for those homes. And that is because they're going to be subject to predatory lending and other discriminatory practices that are targeted towards people of color. I also think about the aspects of employment, specifically equity in terms of career advancement and success. See, how in 2022 can we still be in a place where women only represent 20% of C-suite positions? How can it be that African Americans are still less likely to be hired, paid, and promoted across all types of positions in every industry, even when they were equally qualified and educated? I also think about the criminal justice system, specifically incarceration and police brutality. You see, in 2022, how can it still be that African Americans are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, and they're even more likely to be killed during a routine encounter with law enforcement? These are just a few of many disparities that minority groups and people of different racial and ethnic groups experience. But the real question here is, what is the root of all of this inequality? I believe that we can attribute this to one thing: our minds are at war with our hearts. You see, we have so many different factors around us every single day that are targeting and triggering the way we think about things and the way we act towards people. But at the end of the day, our hearts always know what's right. I'd like to take you guys back to a time that we might all be familiar with, a time when our minds are not at war with our hearts, a time when we were children. This is a snapshot of the reality of my childhood. And what you guys might all agree with is that when we were children, we only have one goal. That's to play, have fun with our friends, and have the best times of our lives. And I really never started to think about the power of this photo until now in my 30s, as I really start to reflect and think about the reality of the country today, where things seem to be anything but united. But even more importantly in this photo that you see here is the aspect that this is something in this time in our lives that is always overlooked. You see, when we were kids, the color of our skin doesn't really matter. Our socioeconomic status doesn't really matter. Our gender doesn't really matter. All that matters is that we're able to get together every day, play our tails off, and have the best times of our lives. Another important aspect of this picture that is really powerful for you guys to understand is the aspect of diversity. As you look at this picture, you see diversity. You see male, you see female, you see black, you see white, you see short, you see tall, you see big, you see small. As you can see, I'm the biggest one in that picture there. But how do we go from being a cohesive group of children just running around and playing every day to what we see in society today? A society where there's more things that divide us than that unite us. It's so important for us to think about what's at the root of all this inequality in the world. The start of the war between our minds and our hearts. And when I state that our minds are at war with our hearts, I'm talking about a concept that is commonly understood, but is still disproportionately impacting people that look like me and people from all other different types of minority groups. The concept of unconscious bias. This is the unconscious categorization of people and groups that our brains execute for us. It is defined as attitudes, preferences, and beliefs about social groups that operate outside of our conscious awareness or control. It's those times where you may have been walking down the street and you encountered an African-American person and maybe you clutched your belongings or maybe even walked the other direction because your mind is trying to consciously categorize this person as someone that is fearful, that's violent, because of all the negative stereotypes that are perpetuated in our life about the African-American culture. These things get stored in our unconscious mind. It might be those times where you even met a Spanish-speaking individual and you were enlightened or actually surprised about how well they spoke English because your mind was trying to unconsciously categorize this person as someone who either couldn't speak English or had a limitation in that regard. It could be that time as if you're in a male in the room and you meet a female for the first time and you want to ask her if she has a girlfriend because you like her, because your mind is automatically categorizing yourself to think that that woman is heterosexual when she may not be. These are just a few of thousands of biases that manifest themselves in our unconscious minds that lead us to putting people in a box. And you might be thinking to yourself right now, why does this matter? Well, this matters because negative biases that are left unchecked lead to actions that can negatively impact the lives of others. Dr. Dana Bowen Matthew, Dean and Professor of Law at George Washington University, published a wealth of literature about unconscious bias and how it manifests itself in our lives. Now, first, it's important to really understand the neuroscience of unconscious bias. This is our brains at work. You see, our brains are constantly working for us, trying to filter out the things that are coming in and out so that we really can understand the realities that are in front of us. The problem with this is that sometimes our brains develop and give us a perspective about something that might not be true. Now, let's talk a little bit more about how unconscious bias goes from thought to action. Now, based on Dr. Matthews' research, there's 3 regions of the brain associated with activating unconscious attitudes. The first is the amygdala. The amygdala is a group of stimuli in the left and right hemispheres of your brain. These control memory, attention, and automatic responses to stimuli. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex are 2 regions of your brain that control the automatic responses in your situations, but they keep those underneath conscious awareness. Well, in other words, they are filtering out what's happening for you without you even realizing it. Let me take this a little step further, as Dr. Matthew also stimulates and talks clearly about how biases go from unconscious thoughts to actions. The first is the stage of social storage of group knowledge. We as individuals, over our whole lives, are accumulating and capturing knowledge across our entire lives. This knowledge comes from things that maybe we saw on TV, things that maybe we heard, things that maybe we've read in books, and most influentially, things that we've been taught. You see, researchers say that we start to develop unconscious biases and categorizations about people as early as the age of 3 years old. The next phase of this process is identification. You see, when you meet someone for the first time, your brain is automatically trying to categorize what's going on and put that person in that box that I talked to you guys about in terms of what your biases in your mind might trigger them to. From here, there's a retrieval of stereotypes. Any negative stereotype that you may have been taught, that you may think is true, starts to get triggered here. We then go into an activation phase. All unconscious biases are then activated, and these form into bias perceptions. Now, what happens from here is now these bias perceptions lead our actions. They lead the way we decide things about people. They lead the way we treat people. They lead the opportunities that we give people. They lead all those types of things. So as we think about this, you might be thinking, well, what's really at stake here? Well, at the end of the day, negative biases can fundamentally shape the lives of everyone in our society. Biases influence the way we treat people, and over time, they influence the way we create policies, systems, and structures. And they're ultimately the reason why we are at where we are today in terms of all the disparities that we have in education, housing, healthcare, wealth, and employment, the most important aspects of our life. So I want to start with the call to action for today. I have a few things that all of us, if we could take some time to do, we can really start changing this world. First is embracing introspection. we all as adults in this world need to take some time to really start thinking about our mindsets, thinking about all the things that we believe about people and groups and why we believe those things. The second is the concept of learning to unlearn. We have to start learning how to unlearn all the negative and false stereotypes about people that influence our actions and look at every individual as unique. The next step we need to really look at is starting a journey of becoming anti-bias. We need to get to a point in our lives where every decision we make is based in fact and is wholehearted. It is not riddled in bias or negative stereotypes. Now I want to take this a step deeper in closing, because I think there's one thing that we can all really decide and agree upon that's at stake, and that's our families. Our families are at stake. You see, we live in a world today where we don't really seem to care about inequity, discrimination, unconscious bias, disparities, or things like that until they directly impact the people that we love. So I'm going to leave you guys with one question here. If our minds were no longer at war with our hearts, and all of our actions could be based in love, the way they were designed to from the start, if you could change the whole life course of your communities and your families, if you could be a part of changing the world, if you could help redefine humanity, would you join in? Thank you.